Next, we'll have this distinguished panel. But before that, I think I need to thank everyone for coming and thank the Center, Atif, the Palabi, everyone for putting together this really amazing conference, not just for the profession, but also for Africa. And you can see that from the different panels. So I'll try to stay calm because I might be a bit overly exuberant for the reason I just gave earlier. Another thing, I'm also excited because as you may know, I'll be talking about my movie during. Do you hear that? Yeah, during the Woman King that I was the historian of. So anyway, trade and regional flows. This is the panel. Let me say a few words about motivation. We need really to understand the potential that Africa has in terms of open trade for regional and not only at regional, continental level, and how we can strengthen growth prospect on the continent. On the downside, Africa is still very marginal in terms of global trade, 3%. Much of the exports is agriculture, natural resources. Service improving. I mean, the service sector is improving in Africa today, 24%, which is very much at the global level. And, currently there are threats to progress on trade in Africa that are represented by, the current economic downturn around the world. But there are issues, that hopefully we are going to address, some of structural issues that can come from colonial legacy and high dependence on natural resource and agriculture, and issues of innovation, infrastructure, and connectivity that barriers to trade, but also entrepreneurial human capital. There is a huge potential for entrepreneurship in Africa that are being missed, because of lack of investments in not only human capital, but also entrepreneurial human capital. So, but there are opportunities, some of the opportunities that we are going to be talking about are the African Continental Free Trade Area, that present a platform, for progress. We also have the U.S. African Growth Opportunity Act, that's also, and besides that, there are also a growing number of massively, hugely successful, particularly in the tech sector, young entrepreneurs, particularly in places like Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya. So we need, through the discussion we are going to have, talk about what get us there, and then how do we get out of it, And we have a very distinguished panel, as I said earlier. So starting with Dr. Ibrahim Mayaki, that I don't have to present because my colleague from AUDA-NEPAD have already done it. But he is a very unique in terms of analytics and policy-making experience. And, he was Prime Minister of Niger. He also led the National Dialogue Commission that helped the transition, political transition in Niger. And he has also a very impressive experience in running continental organizations, particularly AUDA-NEPAD, that he did a wonderful job on leading. So we also have Hippolyte Fofack, who is the Chief Economist and Director of Research at the International Cooperation for African Exports and Import Bank. He has 20 years of experience in development economics, international trade, banking, international finance. And prior to the Afri-Mixed, Afri-SIM, he worked at the World Bank, where he took various portfolio, including the head of Macroeconomics and Growth Program. He's a very distinguished academics, fellow of African Academy of Sciences, and member of American Economic Association and African Finance Economic Association as well. So he has a master's degree from Lille and PhD advanced degree in economics and finance from the University of Bordeaux, France. Last not least, we have Professor Nina Pavcnik, who is the Niehaus Family Professor, International Studies and Professor of Economics at Dartmouth. So her research is focused on international trade, and particularly the impact of trade on the lives of workers, families, and children in particular. And she also studied how companies respond to challenges and opportunity of globalization. So she's the current editor of the World Bank Economic Review and General Economic Perspective. So I was very honored to have contributed to a General Economic Perspective, and she was a first-rate, fantastic editor, so for those who want to submit to the journal, when she's still there, so don't miss the opportunity. Anyway, at Dartmouth, she served as chair of the Department of Economics and the dean of faculty. And she has the award for mentoring and advising, and research associate at NBER and the Center for Economic Policy Research as well. So as you see, we have a wonderful mix of academics, policy experience, and I'm pretty sure that it will be a wonderful panel. Thank you very much. We are going to start with Dr. Mayaki's address. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm really sorry not to be able to join, but I would like to first start by thanking you for inviting me. I'm very honored by that, and I have a high appreciation for what you are doing and for what Professor Wantchekon is pushing forward for the African continent. I was stopped by my back in Paris. Anyway, I sent a presentation on PowerPoint, a few slides. I won't be able to comment them. I will make reference to them, but I wanted to highlight 4 key points in my view regarding this theme. The first one is about the context in which the African Continental Free Trade Agreement was designed. There were 2 schools of thought. One school of thought did preach a top-down process, saying let's go continental and fix the issues as they come. And the second school of thought was thinking about a bottom-up process. Let's strengthen the regional economic communities, increase free trade within the regional economic communities, and then at a certain level of critical strength, these regional economic communities will be linked so that we have a continental free trade area. The first school of thought won, and the heads of states of the African Union followed that way. That school of thought and its implementation process has 2 main characteristics in my view. The first one is that it will be harder in terms of implementation because the complexity of the transactions will be higher. And secondly, it will implicate enormous political will so that the experts and the technical staff of the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat can move on and have a political solution to a technical problem every time they move on. That's my first point. Why am I referring to that point of context? Because it has an implication of the second point that I will highlight. And the second point is about what the experts generally refer to in terms of numbers as the level of intra-Africa trade. Generally, you read in most of the documents which have to do with intra-Africa trade but it's at 12, 13, 14%. But in reality, these numbers, as we all know, do not take into account all what is about the informal economy and the transboundary interactions that do take place. So most probably, the level of intra-Africa trade should be around 20, 25%, which is not neglectable. And maybe it is higher, we don't know. But we have to find out, because by finding out, it will help us tackle the causes which make this informal trade feasible, and then link these causes to the issue of implementation of a continental free trade agreement that we are trying to implement. My third point, which is highlighted in my presentation, is that many strategic frameworks have been put in place in order to accelerate intra-Africa trade. The single air transport market, the protocol on free movement of persons, the right to residence and right to establishment, and the accelerated industrial development of Africa. All these frameworks are declined in regional strategies and then afterwards in national plans. The optimality, evidently, is at regional level. But for implementation to take place effectively, the link between the regional level and the national level has to be coherent, efficient, and clearly owned at the national level. And that leads me to my third point, which is the link with macroeconomic policy. I think there is a void there regarding the type of macroeconomic policies which are necessary in order to optimize the implementation of measures that have as an objective to increase intra-Africa trade. I'm not sure. I think I tried to see if studies did exist. I didn't get them, but very humbly, I'm not the specialists who should look at this. I think there are much more competent people than I am in order to look at it, but it is important to look at it. So that we ask ourselves, do macroeconomic policies at national level, well, what type of effect macroeconomic policies at national level have on regional strategies and the implementation of a continental framework? This is very important because out of this analysis, we could draw a certain number of conclusions that would allow us to better enhance the critical points which will help us better implement the continental free trade agreement. And my fourth point is about politics and governance and institutions. I think that in order to increase our intra-Africa trade, stimulate the implementation of a continental free trade agreement, the main obstacle to tackle is evidently fragmentation, and that's why they were created, these frameworks. And fragmentation has a psychological consequence in terms of schizophrenia, because you have leaders at the national level who want at the same time to build institutions nationally, but are also pulled by the regional level in order to strengthen regional institutions. And I don't think the balance between national building processes and regional building processes, that balance politically has not been yet reached. So these are the points I wanted to make very briefly and not take much time because I'm not present physically. And I'm sure the conclusions of this seminar will be very important, and I'm looking forward to them. And I will also use them in my capacity as the African Union Special Envoy on Food Systems. I thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I really, first of all, like to thank the organizer of this conference, really, for associating the African Export-Import Bank to a session that is very timely, very important. And I also like to thank Dr. Leonard, really, for what he's been doing tirelessly to promote the teaching of economics within the African continent. I think Africa has often been marginalized in that space. So what you're doing to build capacity to have a more inclusive world in the space of knowledge and knowledge sharing is critical. We're very grateful for that, quite frankly. And allow me to also acknowledge the presence of Dr. Kati Patilo. I think she's been wonderful in the world of development from the IMF side and working closely with across the world, across the globe, to really advance that important agenda, especially from a fiscal standpoint. And thank you very much for doing that. I think you've asked us, Professor Wantchekon, to look at the interaction between intra-regional trade and diversifications, which is a very important topic, and which is also centered to what the African Export-Import Bank is doing. And we believe that the topic is timely because really this increasing push for diversifying supply chains, if you look at the recent literature, the issue of offshoring, friendshoring, yieldings relate to that increasing importance. And this provides, in our view, a wonderful opportunity for Africa to actually capitalize on that, to finally enter the space of global value chains. The topic is also very timely because, as you well know, as you said in your introductions, the diversification of sub-Saharan trade, which has provided a path to exit poverty in Asia, in Europe, in other parts of the world, has actually eluded Africa for decades. I think that is a fact, and that's something we have to really tackle. That's why I found this topic quite timely and relevant for what the continent is facing currently. And in fact, as the manufacturing content of global trade expanded, and the stickiness, what we call the stickiness of the colonial development of resource extractions actually led to a steady decline of Africa's contribution to global trade, which has fallen below 3% compared to about 5% at independence. And this is quite an amazing graph where we see Africa population rising to almost 17% of the world populations, yet our share global trade have been trending downward. I think you saw a little increase as a result of that commodity super cycle, but it ended abruptly in 2015. We are back to almost less than 3%, as I said. And there's another important aspect. I think we talked about the macroeconomic implication that colonial legacy are also very important and significance. For instance, I think the excessive exposure of the region to global volatility and recurrence of balance of payment crisis, which are often more than any other region send African country to the IMF and the World Bank to seek balance of payment support. I think that's another important aspect of the stickiness of excessive dependency on those commodities. At the same time, I think the correlation between growth and commodity price cycle increased the risk of balance of payment pressure and crisis. And of course, I think that overhang, as Kati will actually elaborate more on this. And I think that correlation is largely, in our view, responsible for the perception premium, which has led most countries across the continent to contend with large spread and default-driven borrowing rate. I think Paul Collier wrote a wonderful article in the FT just 2 years ago when we had this, last get downgrade after the pandemic on this specific topic, the issue of default-driven borrowing rate. If you look at Ghana, for instance, which defaulted just a couple of months ago, weeks ago, and look at their spread as we speak, it's actually, in terms of basis points, in the thousands, which is quite significant, essentially shutting the government out of a refinancing window and exposing it significantly. In this graph, we try to compare Ghana and Italy On the right side, Italy is about, the spread's about 7%, 7% for Italy. And Ghana, it's around, the yield around 28%, which essentially said that they're out of the market. But the stickiness of that colonial resource extractions also has implications for welfare. And quite strangely, I mentioned 17% of the world populations. Contrast that against the fact that 60% of the world living in extreme poverty today are within the African continent, and you get the magnitude of those implications in terms of welfare beyond the macroeconomics that we mentioned earlier. But the good news is it wasn't supposed to be that way, quite frankly. And back in the 70s, Gonamirda wrote a wonderful book, The Asian Drama, where he actually predicted that Africa prospect would be far better than those of the overpopulated Asia. Unfortunately, unlike Africa, where natural resources continue to be the main drivers of growth, Asia actually managed to successfully diversify its economic source of growth and ultimately went through a brighter future. That's why your topic is so important, I think, this topic for this year. And the question you have for us is, can intra-African trade put African economy on a similar path, the Asian path, the Asian emerging market economic path? I think I will say definitely yes, but we have to establish that as we go through this exercise. But to do that, let's have a quick overview about the structure of African economies. I think that overview actually provides a clear illustration of the consequence of that stickiness of the colonial development of resource extraction that we mentioned earlier. I think despite several attempts by African government to diversify the Sub-Saharan growth and trade, their economies, I think it's still very much the weight of that extraction is still very profound and undermining that transformation process. Just take Nigeria, the largest economy within the continent. I think 90% of foreign exchange earnings is from oil, and almost 60% of government revenue from that same sector. It's quite remarkable. And natural resources, which have been the major drivers of growth across Africa, are not particularly labor intensive and could explain, in our view, the high incidence of poverty, but also informality that Dr. Mayaki mentioned earlier in his remark. It's actually one important driver. Natural resources also dominate African trade, and according to UNCTAD, just 5 countries actually migrated out of dependency of the last almost 60 years, and further highlighting that stickiness that we mentioned about earlier. And the UNCTAD study, the issue of the state of commodity in the world, says that more than 80% of African countries are actually trapped in that dependency, which is quite significant. In addition to the boom-bust cycle, I think the current structure of African trade and economy has exposed the regions to long-term deteriorations in terms of trade. It's also responsible for the decreasing African contribution to global trade mentioned earlier. Compare Africa, 1.4 billion, against Holland, Netherlands, and you see the stark contrast where, in terms of global trade, Holland actually weighed far more than Africa. It's quite significant, reflecting those consequences. You mentioned AGOA earlier in your introduction, Professor Wantchekon. I think here we try to look at the top 25 trading partner of the US, and it's remarkable that we could not find a single African country, yet to have Vietnam's, which in the span of 10, 15 years has become a major player. In fact, I'm told that almost 25% of cell phone components are manufactured in Vietnam, which are successfully integrated in that global value chains of frontier technology, and the benefit are significant. So despite AGOA, we've not been able to benefit, reflecting that structure of African economies. What the US importing the most are essentially those manufactured goods. But the structure of African economies also shape the compositions and directions of African trade. And as part of that colonial legacy, African trade has remained highly extroverted. It's another important dimension of African trade. And Dr. Mayaki mentioned 15% as a share in African trade against 72% within the EU and almost 67% in Asia. And the highly extroverted directions of trade expose the region to volatility, as we said earlier. But across the regions, economic policy, talking about macroeconomics, has been reduced to balance of payment crisis management as a result. But another important characteristic feature of intra-African trade is the dominance of manufacturing. And this is actually very important if we have to answer your questions. And we have that composition where, as overall, manufacturing is almost 45% of intra-African trade, while the commodities, the extra-African trade, is dominated by commodities. While primary commodities and natural resources dominate extra-African trade, manufacture would dominate intra-African trade, and this is significant. In other words, intra-African trade and industrializations will be mutually reinforcing within the continent. Under certain conditions, regularity conditions, intra-African trade could actually accelerate the process of industrializations and diversifications of sorts of growth and trade in Africa. Can the AFCFTA, which entered into force almost 2 years ago, be actually the trade reform that will boost industrializations? Is a question that we have to answer. And can the AFCFTA be a catalytic force? And trade integration, if you look at what has happened in Asia, but also the part of the world, has been really a major driver in the diversification source of growth, with tremendous prospect in terms of enhancing integration to global value chains. We believe that the defragmentation of Africa envisaged in the AFCFTA is expected to produce and could produce similar results within the African continents, in the sense that it will accelerate the development of regional value chains and the transformation of African economies to raise Africa's share of global trade compared to what we currently have. In a sense, I think by allowing corporations to spread the risk of investing in small markets, economies of scale associated with AFCFTA will boost productivity and competitiveness of African economies to accelerate the development of regional value chains and to gradually enable Africa to integrate global network of frontier technology, as Vietnam mentioned earlier. And what is encouraging is that preliminary results are actually very encouraging regarding the potential impact of the AFCFTA in terms of diversifications and boost to African trade. In particular, I think we look at estimate, it shows that the free trade agreement will actually boost intra-African export by almost 80% and extra-African export by about 20% with the next decade. And what is also more interesting, going back to your question specifically, is that manufactured goods are expected to achieve the largest gain, 110% increase in intra-African trade. So you can begin to see the mutually reinforcing nature of intra-African trade and industrializations hypothetically. And the fact that most study, including the IMF study and the FDB, the World Bank, are consistently yielding similar results on the potential impact of this trade agreement for the diversification of sorts of growth are actually very encouraging and not surprising at the same time, because over the years, the correlation between manufacturing output growth and economic growth has been both positive and strong. But also, not only is the share manufacturing in GDP positively related to economic growth, manufacturing growth, output growth is actually poverty reducing, and its poverty reducing effect tend to be more important in low-income countries. And at the same time, I think the importance of manufacturing actually being tested and theoretically and actually it's supported by strong theoretical foundations. We'll just have to look at what's happened in advanced economies, especially the US, where, for instance, manufacturing offers specific opportunity for capital accumulations. As more recently, look at the US, it's actually drive over 20% of capital accumulation in the US settings. So we are actually almost certain that under the right infrastructure environment, the potential benefit of the AFCFTA could be significant. And essentially, we believe that the AFCFTA could reshape global value chains and potentially end the marginalization of Africa in the global trading system. And to just highlight the extent of that marginalization, you take the bicycle, which is really a sophisticated product. And the countries which are part of that value chains, we could not find a single African country. It's Europe, Asia, and North America in that space. That's at the lower end product. If we move to high tech, the plane, for instance, we have the same distributions. In other words, Africa, which has a raw material, even for rubber, and what you used to have the tire for the bicycle are not manufactured within the African continent because the rule has been to export rubber and transform it elsewhere. And that marginalization that we see both at lower and high end, it's something that we believe that by fully implementing the AFCFTA and developing regional value chains appropriately, we begin to address that in a way that create the conditions for a more inclusive process of globalizations. In fact, I think the removal of tariffs and non-tariff barrier across member countries will facilitate the sourcing within Africa to form really regional manufacturing clusters. I think significant progress have been made within the regions with improving business environment and investment climate, which are likely to further enhance AFCFTA implementations. But in addition to benefit in terms of inherent economies of scale and productivity gains, a few provisions under the AFCFTA are special. It will actually play a major role in advancing the process of industrialization. I think one of the most important one is the rules of origin, which we consider the industrialization accelerator, prioritizing local value additions, will further catalyze technology transfer and development of regional value chains. I think the rules of origin is actually very critical. It will address the transshipment that we see between Benin and Nigeria in a way that will actually create the conditions for indigenous growth. Also important is intellectual property right, also critical, as well as the protocol on investment and competitions, which will be other major drivers of structural transformations and diversifications. But the key questions that some of you may be asking, is this real? Is the AFCFTA panacea? I mean, and I think I will contend with that. I think I fully agree that I think it's not a panacea. So we believe that although necessary, it is important to stress that the AFCFTA is not a sufficient conditions for diversifications and global convergence. As an example of Asian major market economic shows, no policy objective is as critical on the part of convergence than closing the technological deficit, but also addressing the issue of human resources and skills. I think investing human capital to close technology gap deficit actually critical to lifting the supply side constraint and diversifying the source of growth. It's very important to stress that upfront. Investment in critical innovation system, research and technology is also very important at this critical juncture. I think Professor Wantchekon mentioned the issue of infrastructure as a key constraint. We'll have to alleviate that. Even more important, in a continent which has a lot of landlocked countries, the issue of cross-border trade will have to be addressed through infrastructure constraints. I think what is interesting and encouraging is the boom in the IT, the unicorn in the IT space, and the financial inclusion and services through technology is very encouraging. But I think we have to go beyond that and address infrastructure across the board, not just the IT infrastructure, but also the physical infrastructure, the power. And we all know the importance of power, even more so after the Ukraine crisis, how critical it is. And look at South Africa, for instance, where the power outage has become a major constraint to growth, as we see in numerous IMF reports how South Africa has been constrained by deficit of energy. At the same time, I think it's important to strengthen that public-private partnership and to advance transformation. I think that's very critical to have that partnership, the private sector, the governments and academia, in a way that will create a system for really innovations that drive growth and productivities. And financing African trade is also very important. I think we've done our study. I think the trade financing gap in the continent annually is about $120 billion. It's a major constraint that we'll have to overcome to really support the growth of trade as an engine for transformations. And I mentioned earlier the rules of origins as a critical tool to actually achieve that and mitigating the risk of anthropo trade, but also transshipment. Also important is trade facilitations. And as we mentioned earlier, we are using the AFCFTA to address the tariff barriers, but non-tariff barriers are just as important, if not more important. Within the region, we have to combine the two to actually promote trade and use intra-African trade as mutual enforcing tool for diversifications. Last but not least, I think speaking one voice in the AFCFTA era is perhaps the most important challenge. I think that one that would strengthen African bargaining power in international trade negotiations and resist the rush to bilateral trade. I think over the years, these bilateral trades have actually kept Africa at the short end of international trade negotiation sticks, leading to trade deflections and weakening African voice at the global level. I think this is one important challenge that we'll have to manage at the continental level with 55 nations. Another important challenge to highlight is how to navigate the fraught geopolitical environment to sustain the rise of regional value chains and effective integration of global value chains, either through nearshoring or friendshoring. And if we come too close to the US, China will not be happy. Too close to China, the US. I think that's one issue that we have to manage in actually getting more of the global redistributions of supply chains. And how to manage the adjustment cost of unequal distribution of inherent benefits. And we may have that as another challenge, which will emerge very soon as we get into full implementations. And even though the benefit of speaking one voice at the global level are significant, but in terms of trade, growth, and effective integration in global economy, how do we get 55 countries to do so and consistently? And in the new race for natural resources, how to change the mindset, which has for centuries reduced Africa as the continent where to get the resources, natural resources, and not manufacture goods. I think that's, in our view, is one of the most important and critical challenge that we have to overcome going forward. And to close, Chairman, I think, can intra-African trade accelerate diversification? I think the short answer to your question is yes, because international trade and industrialization, as I said earlier, are mutually reinforcing in Africa. Manufactured goods dominate intra-African trade, and the rules of origin underpinning the AFCFTA will accelerate the economic diversification power of intra-African trade, which will remain very low, 15%, leaving enough room for growth in the coming years and decades. How to mobilize patient capital to close infrastructure deficit in a region where financing gap remain very important, either for trade and infrastructure, is one issue that we have to address, notwithstanding the perception premium and the high fiscal incidence of sovereign debt on the domestic resource mobilizations. In the new global race for natural resources, including the green minerals, the cobalt, lithium and so forth. How do we change the mindset, which, as I said earlier, has led the world to see Africa as home for natural resources instead of manufactured goods, is a key challenge. And to reflect on that challenge, I wanted to close with a quote from John Mayaki, who, way before us, actually confronted this. The difficulty lies not so much in developing new ideas as in escaping from the old ones. I think the old ones is that colonial development model resource extractions, which has been very sticky, and now we have to make sure that it becomes more fluid. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much for including me in this panel. I'm definitely the academic on the panel. And so I'm going to come back, kind of retouch some of these issues that Dr. Fofack and Mayaki already discussed, but from like a more, from a different, a little bit like different perspective. As was mentioned already, there have been quite a few already attempts at regional integration, but at much, much smaller scale than African continental free trade area. So that picture there draws various combinations of regional trade agreements existing in Africa in 2019, and you see that there are many, there are many combinations there. But I think the power of Africa's continental free trade area is that it enhances a lot of countries. So, from the perspective of a kind of economist, yes. Oh, yes. Here.
Thank you.
Better. Thank you. Yeah. So the perspective of economists, the regional integration implied by it, has a lot of promise because, if you look at economic theory, we have for a long time predicted that regional integration could strengthen economic performance and productivity as long as, for example, the effects of trade creation exceed trade diversion. And like the more countries you have involved and the more diverse they are, you're going to be more likely to be able to specialize according to comparative advantage without excluding, countries from which you would like really benefit from trading with. And in addition, with larger markets, you're going to be reaping economies of scale. You're also going to have access to cheaper and just broader variety of goods, as well as production inputs. And kind of going back to the themes that were mentioned in the introduction, you have companies are going to just have bigger incentive for process and product innovation because you're going to be able to cover the fixed cost of these processes. So from the theoretical perspective, there's a lot of promise there. And in fact, it has been mentioned before that, many organizations have tried to use economic models to predict what are the welfare gains from this. And the welfare gains tend to be positive. So it seems like the trade creation gains are exceeding the kind of trade diversion ones. For example, the prediction from the IMF, it's about 2.6% welfare gain for Sub-Saharan Africa. And most of these gains actually come from elimination on non-tariff barriers rather than tariffs, because tariffs actually have been relatively low, especially in comparison to non-tariff barriers to trade, as Dr. Fofack said this before. And as has been said before, what's really exciting about this agreement is that it's actually, it's predicted to expand trade in foods and manufactured goods, which, as was mentioned earlier, have a lot of kind of potential to jumpstart kind of the process of industrialization and productivity growth. However, what I want to focus on is that a lot of these predictions are based on kind of the usual standard trade models that we have that do not, but which are great in terms of kind of first order effects. However, they do not take into account that resources might be misallocated across companies. Because they basically assume kind of perfect allocation of resources. And they also don't incorporate the fact that companies might be facing financial constraints, labor might not be as mobile, technology might not flow easily across countries, information might not either. So, in some sense, these estimates don't actually fully capture the environment in which companies in low and middle income countries operate. So just take an example of Ghana, and this is when companies in Ghana are asked, what's the main obstacle that they face, you see that a lot of them are pointing to finance, which is going to be, I'm not going to touch on that because that's going to be a topic of, the keynote as well as a session tomorrow. And you see that, a lot of them are worried about lack of electricity, as well, and customs and trade regulations, about 7% mentioned that. But, the thing to remember is that, the companies do feel they face quite a bit of obstacles. And more recently, people have started focusing on, how does trade integration interact with these domestic distortions, and these were, again, the themes that in your conclusions were as well emphasized. There are quite a few obstacles that companies could face. In my, some of them happen subject due to the policies at the borders. For example, the way how our customs run, in addition to kind of tariff barriers or non-tariff barriers to trade, and others happen in production stages. So things like access to finance, energy, land, material, and then others through infrastructure. How are you moving actually goods and people and managers across space. And I think, when we are thinking about this question about can intra-African trade strengthen economists, I think it is important to consider, how the constraints that companies are facing in this setting and intermediaries are facing in this setting interact with trade. And I think, all of you who are involved in policy and, people who are running the companies actually know those constraints the best. From the academic perspective, it's been actually really interesting to see that there's a lot of new booming literature that is actually summarized in this VoxDev Lit survey recently, and it's a live literature survey. As new studies happen, they are added to it. But from my perspective, it's actually exciting that academic literature has increasingly started to focus on these sort of constraints when they're thinking about how do companies benefit from trade integration. And I'm just going to kind of highlight 3 examples of that and then conclude. So from the perspective of from Sub-Saharan Africa, one thing that one needs to very much pay attention is that when it comes to employment in general and manufacturing employment, it's dominated by informality. So these graphs come from a recent piece by Macmillan and Fofack, and you basically see that manufacturing employment has increased in quite a few African economies in the last 20 years. However, a lot of these increase happened from employment in kind of informal firms. There are very few exceptions to this rule. For most cases, most of this employment has been in informal firms. And that's important to consider because this small, first of all, it's important to know, well, why do we have more informal firms? Why aren't they growing? And then second of all, these firms are going to be facing different constraints than potentially larger firms. And the question is, does this new continental trade agreement give incentives to firms to either grow or for new larger firms to enter and take advantage of these trade opportunities? But this is definitely something one needs to consider. The other thing that I'm going to focus on, because I'm focusing on more trade-related issue, is information and contractual barriers to trade. So, traders are going to be facing very large costs to learn about products in distant markets. And this doesn't just affect wholesalers, but even if you're a company trying to source inputs from elsewhere, you would like to know what is the quality and reliability of those inputs. So this is going to be both affecting kind of consumer goods as well as production goods. On top of that, you could say, well, you could just write a contract that you have to deliver high quality goods with these specifications. But we know that contracts are really, really difficult to enforce internationally, and especially when they involve kind of smaller scale companies. And a good example here where actually a colleague of mine, Meredith Starr, that actually went out there and collected kind of representative data on Nigerian importers who basically trade consumer goods such as clothing, electronics, hardware, houseware. What she found is that despite very, very costly travel to source these goods, 2/3 of the importers actually travel internationally to meet suppliers and purchase goods, rather than order these goods on the phone or online. And the reason for that is that these are differentiated goods, so it's actually really hard to detect their true quality online or via phone. And also, even some of the survey responders, even when they had like long-term relationships with their suppliers, they just said they did not trust them. So they felt that you do need to travel to inspect these goods and purchase them. And what she actually found is that basically these product search and contracting problems actually reduced welfare by about 23% in trade for consumer goods, because these frictions actually restrict the types of goods that are being sourced and actually lower profits because the fixed cost of travel are just so high. And if you compare, these costs are usually pretty hard to measure. She had like special data to measure them. But when we actually take them into account, they actually their cost is about like over half the size of kind of the usual welfare losses we have to traditional trade barriers such as tariffs or quotas. So what I want to mention is if this trade agreement is actually able to reduce some of this information and contractual barriers to trade, they're actually really this is good news, because potential gains from it are going to go beyond the number that I've shown you from the standard trade models, because there are these additional frictions you would be overcoming. And we actually have positive evidence that technology, for example, such as mobile phone, can help reduce information frictions in some markets, but they tend to be more helpful in markets where there's mostly kind of uncertainty about price as opposed to the quality of the product. But that's technology can help us there a little bit. But travel actually can allow traders to overcome these frictions even in more kind of complex products. So some of the policies that were brought up in the first talk in terms of unifying the airspace travel across African countries, lowering visa requirements. Information in aggregation via trade fairs and credit bureaus might be all helpful here. Also, thinking about creatively about financial services that kind of help deal with these contractual problems, maybe escrow accounts for small companies. And in fact, we actually more broadly have evidence from kind of more globally, that when air links between countries increase, that raises business ties, and also movements of people that are then followed by movements of investments. So I think there is hope there. And then there's also work by some economists that are actually trying to figure out, if you're become part of a global value chain, how can you use relational contracting to address some of these barriers to trade? So I think the good news here is that there's actually a lot of interest in trying to identify these problems, measure them, and kind of try to figure out how to alleviate them. The final point that I want to make is this point about reforming trade institutions. Okay, so when you have high barriers to trade, be it tariffs or just kind of a lot of paperwork at the border, and markets are very protected, why might that lead to kind of increase in distortions in how countries trade with each other? Well, these companies basically create customs so that they can manage kind of collection of tariffs and just manage trade barriers. Okay, But we know that institutions just in general are subject to bureaucratic capture. So, and oftentimes custom agents actually have a lot of discretion to either, kind of withhold goods in bonded warehouses. They have, they can assess different tariff duties. They can demand more paperwork, and this actually creates quite a bit of uncertainty and extra cost for people engaged in trade and companies. But oftentimes, companies can get around with that, and they might be, some institutions might actually manage there are some firms that basically kind of figure out how to navigate the system and get around these problems. And to the extent that these firms are actually not also the most efficient firms, that might actually lead to additional distortions in the economy, because you're not actually, trade is actually rewarding companies that just know how to work the system as opposed to more effective companies. If those are the same, then actually there's not that much misallocation. So here, it's going to kind of depend on what's the correlation between kind of knowing the system, being connected, versus how efficient you are in terms of production. But in some cases, depending on what that correlation is, this could lead to misallocation of resources toward less efficient firms, kind of reducing aggregate productivity. And again, if we reform trade institutions, and what's one of the goals of African Continental Free Trade Area is to do so, is if you have custom reforms, these distortions could be reduced, and that could lead to improvements in aggregate productivity, because to the extent that the current institutions are favoring firms that are know how to work the system but are not the most productive, that could actually lead to resource allocation toward more productive firms as these kind of distorted institutions are eliminated. It could also lead to improved tax revenue, even when kind of trade barriers are going down. However, how you implement that really matters. You have to have like credible implementation, and the study by Shelendad actually kind of gets into kind of the political economy of this process. Also, like if this reform is credible, the free trade area might also reduce uncertainty about trade policy in general, like even without any distortions, and reduce uncertainty about regulatory environment, which is, again, we have quite a bit of evidence from other settings that leads to improved incentives for investment and new firm entry. So to conclude, can intra-African trade strengthen economies? I think there are, the conditions are there. It is exciting that this trade would be encouraging more trade in foods and manufactured goods, which, as we have heard before, has been kind of the minority of trade. However, it's important to understand, and people who are on the ground, policymakers and companies, understand best. What are the distortions and constraints that are keeping firms operating at smaller scale right now, or keeping talented entrepreneurs not even entering the market to take advantage of these opportunities. Again, if credible, it could change trade institutions and reduce distortions and uncertainty that limit firm entry and growth. And as coming here as academic, it's encouraging to me that distortions have been acknowledged by even academic trade economists like long time ago, but nobody really has worked too much about them. I think kind of more and more recently, people are focusing on these areas using very broad range of methodological tools, increasingly rich data sources, increasingly focus on these, the interactions between domestic distortions and trade. So I'm kind of looking forward to more work in this area and this connection between policy and academic work. So thank you.
Yeah, so I think you will all agree with me that have been really, really fantastic, brilliant set of presentations. So we only have like 20 minutes left. Maybe try to ask some questions. I'm notoriously known to be a glass half full person. So okay. Africa has grown. I mean, GDP per capita of Africa have doubled over the past 20 years. And Michael Kramer-Willis and co-authors have shown that Africa is converging to the rest of the world. Institutions in Africa look like the rest of the world, and economic performance of Africa look like the rest of the world. So, and even if I agree with everything that has been said, so how do you reconcile, this with Kramer's and Al's conclusion? And maybe can you talk about, ask the question differently. Has anything improved for the past 20 years that can help explain this convergence hypothesis that's being tested? So can you, besides the African free trade, continental free trade agreement area, are there other things in terms of institutions, in terms of infrastructure investment, and that can help explain why, in fact, for the past 20 years, things have looked slightly better than like 40 years ago or 60 years ago?
Can I try first?
Of course.
Okay, very good. I think there are a number of factors that could explain what the Kramers and all call beginning of convergence. I think the first, and I'm speaking under the control of Madame Catherine Patillo, it's a fact that...
You are under control.
It's a fact that, quite frankly, macroeconomic stability has been entrenched within the regions. And I think we've seen that most recently in inflations, the global inflation trend, both within the EU, the US, and except in few exceptions within the continent, we've seen that even under the current hyperinflation mode, many African countries have actually escaped that. And one example, which was quite remarkable, is to see South Africa, where unemployment rate is at Great Depression level, almost 32%, as you know, and yet the central bank governor is actually pressing on, increasing interest rate to make sure inflation under control. So I think on the macroeconomic stability, I think the fund has actually succeeded to entrench that within the continent more so than in the Western world, so to speak. That's a very important factor. And another important factor which may drive convergence, it's really what has happened in the space of the IT.
Okay.
I think the IT space has actually released so much energy. If you look at the implication of IT, especially in the financial sector, financial inclusions, it's been significant. This is your area. I think when you look at the continent, where domestic credit private as a share of GDP in most countries is around 15%, compared to almost 125 in France, in Canada, and so forth. It's been a major driver in opening opportunities, especially in the informal sector. It's been a major driver. And then, of course, one thing that we do not often talk about is what we call the intra-African trade champions, whereby we've seen major African corporations emerging, including billionaire, I can say that. If you look at just the Dangote, let's just focus on Dangote. In Dangote's, if you look at the recent study by the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, they said Dangote factory, the refinery, will enable Nigeria to save more than 40% leakages in foreign exchange. What has happened is that for decades, they would take crude oil to the Gulf of Mexico, refine it there, and bring part of it into the country at a huge cost in terms of leakage of foreign reserve. So that factory is actually going to begin to address that. But that's just on the refinery side. But if you take also the cement, which is a major industry in terms of strategic industry, now we have Dangote cement across the whole continent, in Zambia, in Cameroon, in Ethiopia, and so forth. So something that we used to import, which even though it doesn't really make sense to import cement, given that we had a raw material, we begin to address some of those structural and strategic issues and expanding opportunities. So I think overall, we are beginning to see some critical investment that we anticipate that the AFCAT will catalyze and expand that for more benefit going forward. But I will let you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. As you know, as somebody who grew up in the late '80s in Yugoslavia, I think macroeconomic stability is extremely important. And I think in the past, several decades, we kind of got used to things being stable and forgot how it is when things are not stable. And just kind of following up on your point about technology, one of the kind of very kind of positive studies of kind of like the progress in, for example, like availability of formal employment comes from this study that has examined of how like the bringing in high-speed internet has actually expanding kind of formal employment opportunities in various African countries and finding those effects. So I think there is kind of potential there for technology to bring in new investments and kind of formalization. And the question is like, what else can be done to encourage such investment?
Yeah. So let's then leave now for the audience. So we have make it 5 at a time. So please, what's your name?
Chang, May, Chang.
Okay, Chang. We take 5 questions. Next. No, wait. Yeah.
We're Bing Shen, class of 71.
Okay.
With a long perspective.
Yeah, exactly. That's good. So, all right, who else? Yes.
Kathy Patino.
And then who else? Yeah. Okay, so let's leave it there and with that.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to hear that that Africa has grown so much, but I didn't quite get that doubling of GDP or per capita GDP. But with this growth, could you talk a little bit about the role of education and healthcare, which are instrumental in human capital formation, played in this growth?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. The discussion, the presentation of Professor Fofack and Professor Pavcnik seem to be focused on trade in physical goods.
Yeah.
And I just would like to mention that I think the trade in cultural goods and other non-physical goods are equally important. And I particularly want to mention the example of South Korea. South Korea is now a major exporter of one is gaming software, and secondly, cultural products such as music and movies. And they make a lot of money through royalties and so on in exporting these non-physical goods. And one additional benefit of cultural goods is that it helps to establish a Pan-African identity. That songs and movies that everyone, not everyone, but most of the people in Africa will see. It would establish a Pan-African identity, which I think is helpful.
Fantastic. Kathy?
Yeah, thanks. Great presentations, a lot of food for thought. On the potential benefits of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, as the panelists have noted, reducing the tariff barriers, reducing the non-tariff barriers, but then all the important behind-the-border trade facilitation issues to deal with the domestic distortions are all needed to try to realize these benefits. I was thinking a little bit about Mr. Mayaki's first question about, what are some of the macro things that need to be in place for us also to get these benefits. I thought maybe some of the literature before which had asked why hasn't the previous, regional economic community trade agreements had as much impact, or when doesn't trade agreements have as much impact, find that if implemented at times of sort of downturns, then it's more difficult because some firms are going to be hurt and they're going to release labor, and if it's in an upturn, then you'll find lots of opportunities for those people to move. If it's in a downturn, then you don't get as much benefit. So my question right now, the environment is not great, but is the wisdom then that things are improving, so this is still a good time, and also how do we generally think about those firms, people, countries which are not going to which are going to lose, and what you do then for them to make sure that there's still the support for continued liberalization.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so many countries have like public policies that are favorable towards trade, sometimes like fiscal exonerations, special zones, and often these are input subsidies, but there is some sort of a kind of an impression that it tends to benefit more trade like from overseas, outside Africa. So I wonder whether you think, or in the data, that's like an important fact why regional trade is less developed, despite some of these policies that are tried.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Okay, so maybe we'll get you to comments on education, cultural goods, and how you compensate losers for trade reform and fiscal policies or fiscal policies to basically push for intra-Africa trade. So we want to start?
Go ahead.
No, I think, thank you very much. I think the question is extremely rich. And if I start the question by Professor Chang Mei, and on the issue of the role of education and healthcare, and I think it is a fundamental question, and the short answer is that we've not done as much as we should have, quite frankly, within the continent in that particular sector. And I mentioned Dangote refinery earlier. We had a chance to visit it. What was remarkable during that tour that we visited, he allowed us to undertake, was that out of 100 engineers in that factory, 99 were non-Africans, reflecting that constraint. I was shocked by the deficit, the chronic deficit of engineering. And quite frankly, we are not going to address all the supply side constraints without tackling the issue of human capital in the continent. I think you and I were discussing that earlier.
Yes.
As one of the critical factor. So we talked a lot about Africa having the youngest population on earth. But if the right investment is not done, it's not going to be a dividend. It could be a ticking time bomb. So it is a fundamental issue, a fundamental constraint that we have to address and reallocate resources accordingly. And I am amazed by this Princeton University, quite frankly. I mean, how do we take it to Africa? I mean, maybe half of it in terms of infrastructure, in terms of human capital. I think so. fully concur. It's something that will have to be tackled if we are to really reap the full benefit of the African Continental Free Trade Area agreements. I often say that in terms of population, Africa is almost like China. In terms of market, China is more integrated. And I've told African business leaders that my measure of success of the AFCFTA will be how many African billionaires do we produce. I mean, China's, 30 years, China's produced more billionaires than the rest of the world combined. So that will actually comes if we have animal spirit, successful entrepreneur in various industries, requiring that human capital that you put so well to the first questions. Going back to the class of 71, and I think it's so important what you said. Last year, our trade report focused on African creative and cultural industries because they become the growth industries. I think during the COVID-19, when nothing else was actually crossing border, they were actually selling Nollywood movies across the continent and the globe. So it is a wonderful sector in terms of growth. And you're right, actually, and that industry will actually create a condition for cultural convergence and accelerate the process of integrations. I often say that when young Africans are listening to Nigerian musicians, Afrobeat, they're not thinking of Nigeria. I mean, it's all over, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that convergence, cultural convergence, will be accelerated by that exchange in the cultural industry space. And you'll be pleased to know that it's so important that our bank put together a $500 million fund for CANIX and the African Cultural Exchange Nexus, which every year we actually bring African artists together. And we're actually bringing a movie creator, producer in the US to train African youths to actually build the skill in that space. We believe that it's the future. We've actually been partnering with India Exim, which has a special program to finance the creative. So India Exim, we actually send our staff to India Exim for training. They've come to Cairo so that we can actually begin to really support the Nollywood within Africa, building on the Bollywood experience. So I think I fully concur with you, and really, the Class 71 is something quite inspiring.
Thanks very much.
But I leave those to you.
Yes, if I follow up on your question, definitely when you look at the data, you see that during recessions, tariffs go up in a lot of countries, and also if you look at public perceptions for international trade, they go down, right? It's very easy to blame international trade. I mean, I think the hope is that given that we have this potential for kind of the demographic dividend, that there is the force to push forward, but it is extreme. It is very difficult. I mean, a lot of my research has focused on Vietnam, and people always say how did Vietnam succeed so much? And in a sense, it almost had a perfect creation of events, because basically it had fairly young population, that for its level of development was much more educated than would be expected. And then I think the third thing that then basically it had closed borders with the United States because of the sanctions, and then they opened up at the right time, and then it was really perfectly situated in the East Asian global supply chain, so it was very easy for Taiwanese and South Korean and Japanese multinationals to come in and take advantage of this new exporting opportunities. So the question that I see here is you have a lot of very young workforce that's eager to work. It might not be as educated, maybe not as many engineers, but they are, I think primary education has gone up quite a bit. And the question is, can entrepreneurs come in and like take advantage of the resources, then kind of this that there are there to be creative on how to take advantage of opportunities there, and hopefully with some additional kind of inflow on foreign capital. Going back to your point about like billionaires, I think ultimately if you're going to want trade among Africa within Africa to grow, people need to be able to buy things, right? So I think another issue there is you have a lot of population that's young. If you can actually kind of reduce kind of inequality and kind of increase standards of living, I think that, the chance of this succeeding is going to be higher. And given that the world is turning more protectionist, like United States, UK, and so on, kind of relying on intra-regional trade again might be a more promising way forward than relying on kind of access to rich country markets.
So and
fiscal push
to actually go back to another point raised by the great Kati. I think one thing we've done, we've pushed from the African Union, and the African Union has actually asked our bank to put together the AFCAT adjustment facility. That we put down $1 billion, and the goal is for us to raise up to $8 billion. And that adjustment facilities is to make sure that those which are on the losing side of the AFCFTA in terms of fiscal adjustment, but also the private sector, will actually be able to tap into that fund to make sure that at least at inceptions we have global push, continental push toward trade liberalization within the continent. But as we anticipate that, and I'm very happy that you're here, one issue that will come up down the road, maybe even very soon, will be this issue of really race to the bottom. And how do we make sure that as we get full steam into the agreement, there is no risk of competitive devaluations? And that's something that we should anticipate working with the fund to really mitigate that, because it will be coming. And I can see Rwanda actually, which is actually going for this FDI to play a major role, to use the currency as a tool for FDI attraction investment. So that's an important aspect. And then your questions on
fiscal stimulus,
on preference for extra-African trade, I think that has been the model. And of course, when we are financing special economic zone, export processing zone, we still believe that export-led growth, manufacturing, is the way forward. And it's fair to say that within the African context, and unlike Vietnam, for instance, the African market is such that we'll be able to achieve both, to push for export, but also to meet the intra-African trade. For the reason that we discussed earlier, that manufacturing actually dominates intra-African trade. And so the economies of scale that the AFCFTA offers will actually just justify and that investment into boosting intra-African trade. But another important aspect of your question is that the issue of foreign exchange leakages. And as long as we actually finance intra-African trade in hard currency, it doesn't really matter whether it's export and import. But we believe that the rules of origins become the passport for what is traded within the continent will actually ultimately shift the directions of African trade more toward intra-African trade.
Fantastic. So I think we are maybe even 5 minutes over time. So we have, the keynotes in about 10 minutes. So we might leave it there. We might have to leave it there. And please let's give a round of applause to this. 20 minutes response to the movie and dance part. But, I think I will leave it there for now. We can talk. All right. So thank you very much.
Thank you.